every successful person got there by going through tough times. Success is a hard-ass teacher who likes to knock you around along that journey. You know, it takes real guts to not give up and keep going. We'll hear stories about failures and how these leaders flip the script to create success. I'm John Schultz. Join me and let's discover how success is never really overnight. Welcome to the John Schultz podcast, the myth of overnight success. And my first episode in season 2 is Mr. Eric Gertler. Thanks so much for being on the podcast.
Thank you, John. Pleasure to be here.
Yeah, very excited. Season 2 kickoff. So, Eric, huge career. I know I'm supposed to be brief, and I'll try to be, but it's not easy. So, early in your career, you started as an attorney with Skadden Arps, which is interesting. You founded and served as CEO of several technology companies in the early 2000s. You did some public service stints. I love it. You served under multiple mayoral administrations in New York City. You were commissioner, president, and CEO of Empire State Development. One of my favorite things about you is you wrote a book. I know I tried. It's impossible. Called Prying Eyes, Protect Your Privacy from People Who Sell to You, Snoop on You, and Steal from You. That's an interesting topic. And today, obviously, you are the executive chairman and CEO of U.S. News and World Report. Welcome, Eric, to the podcast.
Well, thank you for having me. Clearly, my mother called you to ensure that you provided a very kind introduction. But nonetheless, it's a privilege and pleasure to be here today.
Well, thanks for being here. When people start out in life, I think a lot of what we are formed early on. You know, We may not remember, but a lot of those events shape our lives. So I want to start out asking you, where are you originally from, and how would you describe yourself growing up?
Yeah, so I'm from Montreal, in Quebec, Canada, and I would say I had a pretty normal, simple childhood. We grew up as a middle class family, my mother, who worked full time until literally just before COVID, she was a librarian. And my dad was a furniture executive entrepreneur who actually grew up in Western Canada in a small town called Saskatoon, and came to McGill as on a sports scholarship. And so, as you can imagine, based on both of their interests, sports was a big part of our upbringing, and my dad would push sports, and my mother would push books. The only other thing that I would say, which I think is important and ultimately had a big impact on me, is that growing up in Quebec, the late 60s, the early 70s, historically it was a time when the French were asserting their rights and wanting to push forward sort of primacy of the French language. And that was part of the whole separatist movement of wanting to separate Quebec from the rest of Canada. And it created a certain degree of anxiety. It created an uncertainty for the future. While I predominantly lived in the English part of Montreal, I had many friends who were French. I played sports with immigrants from all backgrounds. So I was exposed to a very multicultural, multilingual environment, but there was no question that anxiety was in the background all the time.
So interesting, right? Like, you had anxiety. How did you handle that? And how did it shape maybe what interested you as a kid? Like I know you said sports, you said books. Obviously those are two topics, but how did that shape your interests, and how did you deal with anxiety? I mean, one of the biggest things we're going through today, mental health, is like dealing with anxiety of what's going on in the world.
So I think look, in that regard, I was a kid. It was very present. I remember when, for example, because I walked by his house or one of the houses of at that time the British ambassador. There was a kidnapping of a British ambassador, and so we knew about that as a kid. I mean, back then, things were a lot simpler back then. So it wasn't as though it affected me on a day-to-day basis, but it was the political environment. That made it uncertain in terms of what would happen. For me personally, there were a lot of advantages. I learned French. We took French every day in school. I had friends from many different backgrounds. It was in many ways an opportunity to learn about people from all these different communities. So in that sense, it helped expose me to many different cultures. And Montreal back then was a really cosmopolitan city. I don't think it's not the same anymore, but it was when I was growing up.
That's cool. I love that.
Yep.
It's great. You're able to see so many different things at such a young age. Not everyone gets that ability. So, okay. So you're growing up. Like, what did you want to be when you grew up? Like, what were your aspirations as a young person? Yeah. Fireman, movie star. Like where did you fit into the?
So you got to understand. Growing up in Montreal, there was one thing that mattered, and that was hockey. And, you grew up at a time when the Montreal Canadiens were winning the Stanley Cup, and they won, 5 years in a row. And so, as a kid, given that, hockey is in the DNA of all Canadians, I wanted to be a hockey player. I mean, I played a lot of hockey, growing up. The thrill and love for the game, was always present. But I will say on, sort of on the flip side, early on, when I would look at people, and, as a kid, you look at people, how are they succeeding and who's doing what? At the time, I was just exposed to a lot of people, family members, non-family members, who are lawyers. And I just thought that they seem to be having an impact on society, or doing more interesting things, or having different conversations. And I just, it's just something that was sort of, tucked in the back of my mind. And I think, as you pointed out, I ultimately did work at Skadden Arps for a number of years. And, looking back, I think that had a big influence on what I would ultimately want to be, at least, and it turned out for a short period of time, but it was great training.
And when you went to college, was that part of why you went to college and what you went to college for, or what were you thinking as you entered college for your life's career?
So I will tell you, just to go back and make that connection back to what was going on in Quebec and the uncertainty, and in the mid-70s, the Parti Québécois was elected to government in the province of Quebec on a movement, on the separatist movement. I mean, they had run on a platform to separate Quebec from the rest of Canada. And I remember that night, my mother turned to me and said, "You're going to go to school in the United States, so you better keep up your grades and do well, because it's very expensive to go to school in the United States, but that's where you're going to." And I didn't know what that meant at the time. I didn't know. And it's one of those things you and I talk about, that it was serendipity. I like, you're a kid, and all of a sudden this thing gets said to you. And then a number of years later, my mother was the one that wrote away for applications for me. We didn't know a lot about going to college in the United States. And, I was fortunate. I went to Brown University. And it was a time that exposed me to a lot of things I was very focused in high school, sports, and doing well in school, and students council, and helping in the community. But Brown exposed me to the arts. It exposed me to people from all around the world. But I will tell you, when it came to graduating from college, I didn't have a clue. I mean, most kids at that time, everybody was looking at Wall Street, and I started to, apply to jobs to go to Wall Street. That's what everybody was doing. That's not ultimately what I did, but you sort of, move in the direction that everybody's doing. And I'm glad that I didn't end up going to, going in that direction. Yeah, like as you point out, and we talk a lot. Sometimes, your career just takes you in many different directions.
Yeah, I think most of the time that's the case. We just forget that. Like we think we're in control of all of our moves.
Right.
But I think once you start flowing in a direction of what you're interested in, all these things sort of show up. So was Skadden Arps your first job?
So it was not. Before going to law school, I took I worked for 2 years. I spent a year as an editorial intern at U.S. News and World Report, and I really at that point by the way, talk about not going to Wall Street. I made that year. I graduated from college. I made $12,750 a year. That was my salary. But I learned so much about the world, and I was able to hone my writing skills, and it was really an amazing opportunity. And then I left and went to Paris. I'd spent my junior year in Paris, and I did studies at both the Sorbonne and Sciences Po, and then I worked at the International Herald Tribune, and I had a wonderful job at the International Herald Tribune. And that was fun, living in Paris. And again, I went to Paris not knowing what I was going to do, and sort of made a very complete and fulfilling life in Paris. And then I went to law school, and then I worked at Skadden Arps, and I worked in the Washington D.C. office, and they had just formed a group to do exclusively media, corporate regulatory media work. And at this point, I knew that was an area that I wanted to be in. In fact, in law school, I'd written my law review article on the newspaper business and the failing newspaper doctrine. And so I went to Skadden, and it was terrific. I enjoyed it. I mean, I wasn't there for a long time. I was there for about 2 years, but I learned the basic training. I learned the importance of the work of an attorney. Developed very good work habits, I think, and certainly enjoyed it.
What were some of the challenges in your mind back then, if you can remember? It's not that long ago, that you felt in early part of your career path. Like what were some of the catalysts and challenges you felt?
So I think early on, I came to the realization that I knew very little. Like, graduated from law school. I did well, and you go to this prestigious law firm. I didn't know anything. I didn't I spent 3 years researching. I didn't really understand how to research. I didn't. I would study issues in journalism, and then understood that. You could do all this reading, and there's a whole other level of understanding, and so that led me to, and when you've talked about my career, I've done a lot of different things. What it's forced me to realize is when you do something new, you have to spend a lot more time listening than talking. You've got to absorb and learn, because in so many of these situations, so little, and not to get over your skis, and I think that is one of the lessons that I learned early on.
I love it. I feel that every day. I mean, if I'm buying a new deal, in real estate, it's a new market, or it's a market that you haven't been in a while. I actually think the fun part about success for me has been everything I've learned and that I can keep learning. The minute I just stop learning, I think it's all over.
Yeah.
All right. So,
And by the way, I agree. Life is it's learning all the time, and things change. So, and so I couldn't agree with you more, John. You got to keep up with the times.
totally. And especially, obviously, your business, it's even harder, right?
Yep.
Because you are what the times are every day. So, okay, here you are, you're early. I've been reading a lot about people lately and what makes people successful. And a lot of it's about relationships, who you've surrounded yourself with. That's the saying, the five people you hang around with are sort of how your life goes. And so tell me about the three most, or, 2, 3, whatever you want, about the most influential people in your life and how they impacted you early on. Because I know I had my 2 or 3 that how like you could forget what you ate last week, but you never forget that impact, right? So who are the people that affected you?
So look, I mean, I talked about. I think that the 2 most influential people have been my parents in very different ways. I mean, my dad, who was an entrepreneur, who instilled in me a very strong work ethic, to always do things in a very principled way, and pushed me. I'd play a hockey game and do well, and my dad'd be like, "Yeah, but in the second period you hit the crossbar, you should have scored," and sort of pushed me, and would also force me to think about, what are you thinking about? Where do you want to go? Every year we'd go for a walk, and he'd say, "What do you have planned for the next year? Where do you want to go? Where are you going?" And he forced me to think about those things, and he had these very simple expressions that, he had one that used to always say, "You can always win if you lose with a smile." And I, for years, I was like, "Why do you want to lose?" But it was about the bigger picture. It was about grace. It was about elegance. It was about, being principled. My mother, was very different. My mother was very much, still, she's very much of an intellect. She was a librarian. Very proud of my mother. She has always followed her passion. She had 2 real passions other than her family: books and travel. She spent the first half of her life on books as a librarian, and the second half, she ran a travel agency and loved to travel herself or vicariously through everybody. And she, instilled a work ethic as well. My mother always worked very hard, and the way she balanced a full-time career and bringing up 3 boys, and she's amazing. But she exposed me to books, to culture, to learning, to curiosity, to travel. I think she helped for myself and my brothers to
Adventure.
help provide us to be more well-rounded people. So I feel very fortunate that I had, 2 parents that had different influences on me.
So what would you say? I mean, that's amazing, right? To have that and to feel that is so good. What would you say the most challenging thing that happened to you early on in your career that made you the most confident in yourself? We all don't want to go through things that don't feel good, but I know for me, that's what made me the most confident. That's what made me feel the next time I can bust through something. Is there anything that you feel is significant for you?
I think for me, there were a number of significant things, early on, and then that sort of played through. And, when I was a kid, for example, I used to go work out at the local Y. And I remember one day, showering, and there wasn't soap. And I said to my dad, "There's no soap in the shower." He goes, "What am I supposed to do? Why don't you go? I'll put you in touch with the president of the Y. You go deal with it." And I And I'm like, okay. And he set me up in the meeting, and I go in and talk to him, and I say, there's no soap. And the guy says, okay, what do you want me to do about it? I go, it's your job. He goes, and I remember him saying, the easiest thing in the world to do is criticize. Come in with a solution. Come in and don't. And, and that has stuck with me because, my career has not been one where I've been at the same company for many, many years. I mean, yes, I've been at U.S. News many times. I think I've had 5 different stints at U.S. News. But as you pointed out, I've started companies and I've written books and I've done public service. And I've been very lucky to be able to follow many of my passions. But to that point, it's that I've accepted that you can go into a place, you're going to make mistakes, you're going to have to try and figure it out. But in the end, if you sort of like, you're reasonable, you respect people, you'll get to the answer. And I think it's more of like, I've learned that I'm comfortable being uncomfortable. It's okay not knowing all the answers. You'll get there. Just don't think don't go tell people like you have all the answers when you don't.
Right. No, that's good. I love how your father, he made you lean into a situation early on. But what I also love is you actually remember that. We don't, when we look back and are asked these questions, the things that, again, you can only remember so much of a long life, right? The things that come up from your consciousness, is amazing that had the impact. So I love that.
It is. You're right. It's so funny. The stories that you remember, or you say something and these little things that at the time you don't really understand it, and then you realize it has an impact.
It's what makes life fun. All right, so today you are the chairman and CEO of U.S. News and World Report, an amazing publication, I might say. Can you give us a little bit about the history of the business?
Yeah. So first of all, it's been such a privilege to have this role as executive chairman and CEO, and this year is an important year because it's the 90th anniversary of U.S. News and World Report. And, and think about it. How many businesses are really around for 90 years? And it started 90 years ago. David Lawrence started it as a newspaper, and it was called a newspaper that was called U.S. News. And then about 13 years later, started a separate publication called World Report, and then combined it into U.S. News and World Report. And the amazing thing is, over the years, the distribution of our content has changed. We've gone from a newspaper to a weekly magazine to an all-digital platform. But what hasn't changed is our values. To provide, objective, important journalism, and our values of making sure that we provide consumers with important information to make the right decisions. And even the news information that we provide, to provide the context for our subscribers and our readership to understand what is going on, in this world. And, and then as part of that journey, which I think is important, in 1984, Mort Zuckerman, who's my uncle, then acquired U.S. News. Mort continued to have an incredible respect for important journalism and high-quality content. And that's been part of our business for 90 years.
You may have to do a new ranking, the oldest companies to still exist. No, I'm not kidding. Yeah. If you look at most companies, they're not here for that long a period of time. That's incredible. Most companies fail the first 5 years. So good for you and the company, and it's still going. So then what would you say the main focus is? It's been around so long, of your businesses today, and how has the publication evolved?
It's important that the focus remains the important pillar of providing, objective, well-sourced information, very often supported by data. Important that we help consumers through their important decisions. And what do I mean by that? In education, we help consumers make the best decisions on where to go to college. We help patients and caregivers on, the best hospital for their surgeries. We are very focused on that user journey, and then of course we're constantly thinking about the verticals. I mean, we're a multifaceted digital media company at this point, and we have deep verticals, deep content in verticals such as finance and travel and education and health, and certainly news. So all of that is sort of where we focus on in terms of the business.
I love that. You do have you go deep. You dive deep.
Yeah.
It's not just cursory news flying at you every day.
Yeah.
That's what I think makes your company different. But there's been this debate over the value of your rankings lately.
Yeah.
So what's your perspective on that? Because I know that's been a big topic of conversation.
So I knew you'd probably ask me about rankings. It's certainly been in the news for the last year. I just wanted to just go back on the last question. I mean, what's interesting about all the verticals that we do is that in many ways, our business reflects the macro economic trends. And so if you think about it, when there's lots of news going on, people are looking at our news. When the economy is not working as well, people or interest rates go up, to use, because that's very specific to your business in real estate. People aren't interested in looking at our mortgage products. Post-COVID, everybody wants to travel. Our travel business is doing really well. So it's very interesting the way we reflect the larger, macro trends. So to go to look at rankings, I think it's important to understand why we do rankings. I mean, rankings is our particular way of doing our journalism. And, our rankings are not like, other companies, that it's subjective. Who's the best looking guy in Hollywood? We have lots and lots of data that we use for our hospital rankings. We have a methodology that's 275 pages. But the way we look at it is that in a world where you are overwhelmed, inundated with a lot of information, where things are so complex, we use our rankings as a way to help you as a consumer understand a complicated area in a way that you can compare and contrast institutions. So you're going to pick a college. As a kid, that is the single most important decision you're now making. It's the first important decision. And depending upon where you go, it's very expensive. It can be as much as $100,000. The admissions process is opaque. You're spending 4 years. You can end up with debt. So what we do is we then give you a roadmap to compare and contrast institutions to help you figure out the best way to go. Now, we accept that we're not the only place. You should use other resources, but that's what we do on the rankings. And education, universities today, these are multi-billion-dollar institutions. Hospitals are large institutions. They're competitive, and when you're essentially comparing and contrasting those institutions, you are in a sense, holding them accountable because you're comparing them, then, they're competitive. We're doing our role as journalists. And so there's often friction. But, and I'll just end by saying this, but if you go in the history of journalism, if media companies are doing their job well, There's tension, whether it's between a media company, a newspaper, and the government, or whatever the case may be. The important part is to have the right values, to have the right principles, to do it in the right way. For us, our North Star has always been the consumer. We want to make sure we're helping that consumer get through that journey. So it's a little bit of a long-winded story. I'm very passionate about the journalism we do, and I want to make sure we continue to hold to a sort of very high level of principles and ethics in terms of what we do.
Yeah, and listen, you went through it, and obviously, you are where you are now, and everyone, got to learn a little bit more about the process of it, right? So you're very transparent.
Yeah, and look, it's also evolving. I mean, how we did the rankings 40 years ago is very different than what we do now. I mean, we continue to evolve. We continue to refine what we look at. The world is not stagnant. Our rankings, have had to continue to evolve and refine themselves.
I love it. All right, so we're at this really interesting time with AI. Okay, yeah. We're just starting to see little point solutions of how it can help us in our work and in all the different things that people are testing, right? Because it's just one big data dump of stuff that now we can see insights that we really could not see, and our brains just can't do it as fast as the quantum computing that's doing this. So where do you see the challenges for what a journalist will be? How will AI assist that journalist? Because you're seeing now, I guess, AI and journalists combine in certain ways on how they're going to write articles. And are we going to ever know who really is writing an article anymore? Like there's so many questions to this that I think is sort of interesting.
John, it's a great question. There's lots to unpack in what you're saying. And we're in early days. Very early days, but from everything that I read, from everything I understand, from everything that you read and understand, this could be, if not one of the most disruptive technologies that we will face in our lifetime, and it'll certainly have huge disruptive possibilities in the media business, and so many media companies are very concerned, and we should be. I mean, you do all of this work, and then it all gets subsumed by AI, and so that's very worrisome. It really creates huge disruption in terms of media company business models. Now, to date, we have not yet seen that it hasn't worked perfectly. But again, this is like we're in the top of the first inning. So the stories that have come out have been, ones that have been considered to be plagiarism. You have that case about that lawyer that used AI to present a brief, and all the articles were wrong. But it'll get better. It'll get really smart, and I think what we're focusing on, and we have our tech team looking at all the ways that we can incorporate it. But at the end of the day, what we are focused on is we have a brand that represents trust. It's a trusted brand. And we have to make sure that in AI, in a world of AI, in a world of disruptive technologies, that we incorporate the best parts, but we're still able to lead and direct the consumer in a way that they know that they can trust what they're reading. But I think that there's we're a long way from a finished product. Media in general, there's going to be potential lawsuits around this, around the intellectual property right about the content. So there is lots to worry about, and lots that's unknown. I don't have all the answers.
Yeah, I feel it's like when the internet just started and Napster just kicked in, and music rights and intellectual property rights, and it's and I think whatever we're thinking today or whatever we're saying in this podcast today, will be nothing like what it really is in the next 2-3 years.
Yeah.
The interesting thing I think about what's going to happen, I just think this is going to be happening so much faster. Like the internet took 10, 12, right? It took many years because everyone didn't have a smartphone. The cloud during COVID, right? It expanded how data is stored. So we're just so further ahead to actually incorporate this now. So it is pretty exciting.
And to your point, I think it was the fastest adopted technology in the history of technologies when AI was introduced.
So then, what would be your top priority, would you say, for the business moving forward?
Yeah. So I look at it sort of severalfold. One is it's still important that we continue to pursue our mission of helping consumers make decisions. We continue to emphasize the principles of the type of journalism that we do, high quality content. Where technology takes us, and by the way, for us, it's not just AI. It's Google is the big rampway into content online. We're a very SEO, search engine optimization driven business. And then I'd say for us, it's ensuring that we're completing the user journey, that we're making sure that we're providing a fulfilling, engaged user journey for our consumers, that when they come to us, we can complete that cycle. They come to us for education. It's not just about the rankings. And in fact, rankings is a small part of what we do. It's about how do you have the right experience? How do you finance college? How do you get the right advice? It's all of that we package. We've got to make sure we continue to do a great job of doing that.
So, and what I keep hearing throughout this entire podcast is consumer focused. That's all you think about every day is how am I serving someone? Yeah. So I want to bring up another topic when it comes to service, right? You've served in the government. Like you said, you had 5 stints at U.S. News and World Report, but you've done a lot of things in between all this stuff. During your career. So what lessons did you learn serving in government, and how did that help you in your career when you're in and out and moving on to your next thing?
So well, thank you for asking about that. I mean, the government service work that I've done, I'm very proud of it, and it's been a privilege to serve, the people of New York City and the people of New York State. I started my first stint was for Mayor Bloomberg. My last stint was for New York State under Governor Cuomo, and I ran Empire State Development, which is the agency focused on economic development, on job growth, of bringing companies to New York, of infrastructure, and leading through COVID was, an incredibly challenging role. And I'm so proud of our team and all the work that everybody in government at New York State did. I think a few of the lessons, first of all, it's in crisis where you understand that government really matters. We can go on in our normal lives and, government certainly plays an impact. But when there's a crisis, the role of government becomes that much more important. The second point is you realize leadership truly matters. We need to have smart, charismatic, engaged leaders. It's the only way this country moves forward. And I think the last thing that I've learned is that I have a lot of friends in the private sector that sometimes dismiss government. Getting things done in government is so much harder than in the private sector. It's 3-dimensional. You don't just have the 2-dimensional issues that you always have in the private sector. You have the third dimension of dealing with the public, of dealing with all of these other all of these other sectors of dealing with the people. And let's remember, you're doing things that, if done right, will have a huge impact on society. One of my great privileges was being part of or leading the last part of the completion of Moynihan Train Hall, and very proud of the work that we did as a team. And but that will be hopefully around for decades. I mean, 100 years. And so you have to think about it in the context of not just doing it, but how is this going to interplay with community and people, transportation, which is changing over the next decades and 100 years. So these are complicated projects, and I loved it, quite frankly. I loved serving, and I felt very privileged to be able to do so.
It's amazing that you did. It just, you're a great person, and I know you, that you're constantly serving people in whatever you do. That's just your mentality. What I love about this podcast and the people on it, you said back in an earlier segment, you got comfortable being uncomfortable as a young person, okay? Yeah. There's no way you could have gotten through COVID if that wasn't something that was ingrained in you as a young person. So it's funny how we always get what we can handle. And a lot of the things that we learn as we're going through our challenges in our lives prepare us for things that we never expected to happen, and we do successfully. And kudos to you. And I want to end this podcast with one last question. You wrote an interesting book pretty much about the industry you're in and what it did. So if you were going to write another book today, what would the book be about?
Wow. So, my book, which was on privacy, which was very early on. It was the first consumer book about consumer privacy, about the age in which data now had begun to define who you were as a human being, how you were being tracked. And I had a business related to identity theft and credit information, and that sort of that came out of that experience. But I will tell you, I've not thought about writing another book. It's hard work. And I've joked that there were days I'd go into my office to write, and I'd write nothing. And and I'd be like, what'd you get done today? Virtually nothing. Now, it's the creative process. The next day I'd write more. I don't have a book per se. I do think that if I were to think about a book, I think it's about the whole confluence of media and AI and misinformation and sort of the search for objectivity. We're living at a time when the extremes are so vocal, and we're losing a sense of hearing the middle and hearing. It's the extremes that are speaking the loudest. And by the way, that's no different when I read history about how it was in this country 200 years ago. I think that there's a great desire to look for solutions in the middle. And maybe I'm naive, and maybe I'm just optimistic. But I would think that there's more work that needs to be done on trying to think about how we, through all facets of society, help to bring together a more of a centrist focus that brings together all parts of society. And I'm not just talking politically, I'm talking media, I'm talking the business sector. There's some real issues that need broad consensus. So
all right. Well, listen, hopefully one day I can read your new book when you get around to it. But listen, I'm so happy you came on. What a great story. So many lessons I learned by listening here today. And this is why I do it. And hopefully, if one or two people get something else from this, I succeeded. So thanks for being on, and I really appreciate it.
Well, you're too kind, John. It's really been a pleasure and a privilege, and I know I will see you around. Thank you for having me on your show.
Hi, John Schultz here. Thank you so much for tuning into this week's episode. Would really appreciate it if you would like, comment, subscribe, and share with your friends. Looking forward to being with you soon.